Thank you everybody for joining us today online and here in Vienna. Hello to everybody around the world. It's really great to be here because as civil society activists, coming to Vienna is an integral part of our quest to leave no stone unturned or no turn unstoned when it comes to the bigger picture of legal reform for our favorite plant. It's always a pleasure and a comfort to meet up with long-standing colleagues, in particular all the feisty, loyal warriors of our Cannabis Embassy, an international coalition of grassroots cannabis activists. However, as we sit here in the hallowed halls of Mordor, attending to the issues of human rights, harm reduction and drug policy reform, a sinister force is at play all over the world. We've just come from David Borden's side event on extrajudicial killings, and it certainly does send a chill down your spine. While some human beings are enjoying the fruits of legally regulated cannabis in a few countries, hundreds and thousands of human beings are being profiled, harassed, intimidated, assaulted, locked up in cages, and even put to death for their use, cultivation, and trade in the cannabis plant. At the center of this stark contrast between various human rights situations sits law enforcement. Here at my 9th CND, it is time. It is time to talk about the police, policing, and the enforcement of laws around our cannabis plant. In 2018, South Africans achieved victory for their constitutional right to use and cultivate cannabis within private spaces. However, not much has changed when it comes to the South African Police Service. We have had enough. Our communities have had enough. The time for action is now. We would not be able to do this work without the support of our academic colleagues at the universities of Cape Town and Bristol, the Open Society Foundations, the UK Research Institute, and of course all of our Fields of Green for All affiliate companies, local and international organizations, and Dach private clubs. Fields of Green for All's police reform project is in 2 parts. Here to tell us about how it all started and why community engagement is where it all starts, Dr. Gernot Klanschning from our Cannabis Africana project at Bristol University. Thank you, Gernot.
Thanks a lot, Myrtle. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming, and especially thanks to Myrtle for organizing this and for organizing that in a second year in a row, because it takes a lot of effort to put this all together, the speakers, so on and so forth. And apologies for the ones that might have heard something related last year where we talked about the same project, but this is the kind of the next step to it that I want to talk about today. So I want to talk a little bit about the research project, Cannabis Africana, and how we got to this idea of working with the police, which we as academics, usually don't do either. We try to keep away in a way. But I think, as Myrtle said, it's something that we had to do, and so I will tell you about this. So I will, please, next slide, Leonardo. Maybe just to mention, this is a collaboration of many, many partners. You can see some of the names at the bottom at the previous slide as well. You don't do these kind of research studies by yourself at the University of Bristol or Cape Town. We do it with a lot of people across various countries, and especially with activists, because they are the driving force. So, we sit in our little chambers and do the research, but the research has no value if you don't have the activists that are actually helping us understand the value of the research. So anyway, so the Cannabis Africana project, it's a project that's actually already finished, so it's of the past, but it never ends, like research never ends really. So it finished in 2024, but we are continuing to work on the outcomes. There will be a book coming, hopefully quite soon as well. We have been saying that for how many years? 10 years. So maybe in another 10 years we might actually have that book. Anyway, but the research, as I said, ran for 4 years, funded by the UK Research Council, so independent, so this is not government related and not business related, we are just doing that for fun in a way. But no, it's really, it's our research, and so we can determine what it's focused on. And maybe a bit different from other kinds of research you might hear about here at the UN, especially at the UNODC. This is a qualitative research study, so we talk to people that are sort of engaging with cannabis in 4 different countries. We interviewed around 200 people, mostly farmers, traders, users, and as well as regulators in those countries. And so we were not interested in the scale or kind of statistics, because they are usually quite problematic, but in the qualitative element. So that was the research study. The question that we asked, very sort of a general one, was, so we talked about, so basically we wanted to find out what's the role of cannabis in people's lives, historically and in a contemporary sense. And very importantly, we looked at rural areas and urban areas. We didn't want to look at it from a crime perspective, but from a livelihoods perspective. The project was cannabis and development in 4 African countries. So quite different from the research you might have come across in other kinds of panels. This was a study that wasn't actually about policy, because we are anthropologists, we are historians, we are political scientists, agrarian studies experts. We don't usually do policy, but we realized very soon that our research has some kind of policy relevance, because the people that actually work in the policy field, policymakers and activists, sort of asked us to talk about our research, because it sort of should inform their activism and their policy. So we worked with those organizations that you can see at the bottom in West Africa. Anyway, we worked with many partners, and Fields of Green was one of them, Transform and others as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are the key findings from that research that actually led us to think about doing work with the police? You know, this is a study that looks at the history of cannabis and its roles in people's livelihoods. So we did find out that cannabis has many different roles or meanings to people across the continent, which very few of them actually were seeing them as a drug. You know, maybe this is the wrong place, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, to talk about cannabis for many of the people we talked to. But it provided a livelihood for many people in the communities we talked to. So they were growing cannabis rather than cocoa to make a living. Many people also used it for medicinal purposes, for spiritual purposes. And it differed according to the place where we studied this crop or this plant. So we studied it, as you can see on the map, in Nigeria, in West Africa. We studied it in Kenya, in South Africa, and also Zimbabwe. And actually, the interesting thing that we found out, not only does cannabis play different roles in these different countries, but the policies in these different countries started to shift. You know, when we started to design the project in 2014, I think, or almost 15, the map would have been all red, basically. But along the way, suddenly the map started to get very colorful. So red symbolizes a prohibitionist approach to cannabis. But as we went along, you know, 2018 or 17, some countries started to liberalize, especially in Southern Africa, but also in North Africa and other places. So our study started to become almost like a comparative study of how things work in a totally prohibitionist country like in Nigeria, where it's very repressive policies on cannabis, and in Kenya, but also how things developed in a context like South Africa or Zimbabwe, which we'll hear about as well, where things have changed. But the interesting thing is these colors are deceiving somehow on the map, because even in the countries that are portrayed as red, there is actually debate about cannabis, not just as a drug, but as a medicine, as an agricultural good. So in Nigeria we have that. We have even some so-called informal decriminalization promoted by the government, although that's another story, not for today. But what we also found is that in many countries the policy reform came from the top. So there wasn't, you know, like you might have in some US states, some kind of popular movement to drive policy reform. And the only country that's probably exceptional in that respect, maybe two, that's Ghana as well, but is actually South Africa. So that's why I think that is a special story, and I think worth looking at as well. Even though we have this color on the map here, it still doesn't mean that prohibition has disappeared. Prohibition and the thinking in a prohibitionist way still continued, and that's what's led us to the thinking about the police. Because even though these countries have reformed their laws and they have created legal markets for cannabis, there is still an illegal market, and there is still very strong prohibitionist thinking about cannabis. And so that's why we went especially to an institution like the police, which should have rethought its behavior, but it actually hasn't. So that was then the question, or how would you help the police, or how would you make the police rethink its ideas about cannabis? Is that actually possible after almost 100 years of prohibition? I don't know. Anyway, my last slide, please. Which brought us to the current project, which I think Simon and Amy will talk about more. The project, the Cannabis Africana one, is finished, but we got some follow-up funding to actually engage in some impact activities to make our research count. That's where we are working with Fields of Green for All, with the South African police, which is SAPS, they call it, I think. So we are planning to develop SOPs for SAPS, which is standard operating procedures for the South African police, supposedly. But that's the aim, and to realign the policing of cannabis with the new laws that exist in South Africa, which have really changed the approach to cannabis. And we wanted to do that in two ways: to develop civil society guidelines. We wanted this not to be just about a conversation between the police and academics, but we wanted civil society to actually, and people that have an experience of cannabis, of all those meanings it has for people, to drive that as well. And so we wanted to develop, co-develop civil society guidelines on policing, as well as the standard operating procedures. And I think Simon will talk more about it. So our project has 3 strands now. We have got all experts. As you can see, everyone is an expert. So we have research and international experts, like Neil, he will talk to this, who advise the project. We have civil society experts like Fields of Green for All and the organizations that they work with. And we have police experts. The police itself actually will have a say in that as well. And it needs to be somehow negotiated. So this is work in progress. It's not finished yet. So we'll see how it goes. And any advice that anyone has here on how to do it or how not to do it, we would be very happy for it. But I leave it at this. We have more information, I think, on the next slides. But that's what I wanted to say. So I think I'm handing over to Amy now. Yeah, to talk more about how we have started that project.
So in 2018, Amy Haystack joined our team at Fields of Green for All, and somehow we haven't driven her away with our craziness, and she's become our Director of Harm Reduction, and she's here today to tell us about the Community Leaders Workshop that we held in Johannesburg 2 weeks ago.
Thank you, Myrtle and Gernot. And if I can quickly quote Myrtle in regards to what Gernot just said, it's not just about changing laws, it's also about changing hearts and minds. And I think that's something we really face with the South African police force. So I'm just going to do a quick summary, and then I have a couple of photos just from our day of our first community workshop. So as Gernot has expressed, it's been over 2 years of hard work and dedication to get to this point of where we're trying to actually work with SAPS, which is our South African police force. So last week we had our first community engagement, which was the policing post-prohibition cannabis in South Africa. The workshop was for community leaders. No police were involved yet, as we wanted everybody in the room to feel safe and comfortable and open to express their concerns and lived experiences without the threat of our police force being there. So we engaged with 25 community organizations and with over 40 community leaders attending in person on the day. We held the events at South Africa's historic Constitution Hill in the Human Rights Conference Room. Each organization delivered statements rooted in lived experience and real encounters with post-prohibition policing. A little bit on the actual venue that we had it at, the Constitution Hill. So there's a picture, just some snaps from the day. Constitution Hill in Johannesburg is a former prison complex turned living museum and the home to South Africa's Constitutional Court. Operating as a prison from 1893 to 1983, it held political activists like Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, as well as thousands of ordinary citizens, symbolizing the nation's journey from colonial apartheid oppression to democracy. This was a groundbreaking gathering for us to engage with and hear how the rights of our community are being abused in a place where so many fought for their freedom. In South Africa, we have over 700 years of cultural and traditional cannabis use. Cannabis is ingrained in our communities, but the harms of prohibition and incarceration are prevalent and continue to this day, despite our private ruling in 2018. It's sort of like decriminalization, but decriminalized, it's not really changed much for us. Some of the 25 represented organizations attending this workshop included the Soweto Cannabis Association. If any of you know much about South Africa, you would have heard about Soweto. The Marijuana Board of South Africa, the African Cultural Heritage Trust, and the Mpondoland Cannabis Association, or Cannabis Belt Association, sorry. So we do have a video at the end, which Myrtle will play, from a dear friend of ours in Mpondoland, Bonke. And Mpondoland is kind of considered by a lot, or many people, the heart of traditional cannabis growing in South Africa. So we had 25 presentations on the day with an overwhelming consensus that we're all experiencing. And that consensus was uneven, inconsistent policing, profiling of marginalized communities, harassment despite constitutional protections, bribery and corruption are rife, and a very real, everyday lived experience in South Africa. Unlawful raids and arrests with often very grave consequences. And I think the gap between what the law says and what is actually happening on the ground remains deeply concerning for all of us in South Africa. Essentially, reforming the way that police work is done is the most powerful form of harm reduction when it comes to cannabis in South Africa. And then as a community and organization, we have spent many years battling against law enforcement. This has reaped little reward. This project, supported by many incredible activists and researchers, is a new strategy and a big step towards what we hope will be a major change in the way enforcement of regulations around the use, cultivation, and trade of cannabis is carried out in South Africa. There's a photo, if you could click to me, that's like a grey wall that was quite impactful for me as a South African. So on the day, this one here, so on the day, it's inside ironic, I had the freedom to explore Constitution Hill a little bit, and I found the isolation units where prisoners were held in solitary confinement, and it was harrowing to be standing in that room. But I spotted this on the wall. So in South Africa, dacha is a word we use for cannabis. Dacha, it comes from the word dacha, which is our nation's first word for cannabis. So if you can see, I'm not sure if it shows so well there, but it literally has scratched into these isolation cells, "I was here for dacha." And we don't know who that was or when that was, but I thought that was quite a moment for me, especially standing in that cell near the women's prisons. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And next up we have Dr. Clemens Rusenga, who hails from our neighboring country of Zimbabwe. He currently teaches at Cardiff University in Wales, and he has his PhD in land and agrarian studies. And anybody who knows anything about Southern Africa knows that the issues of land are always central to every single debate, including the drug policy debate. So joining us from Cardiff, hello Clemens, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Hi Meto, hi everyone. My name is Clemens Rusenga. Meto has already given a little introduction about myself. I come from Zimbabwe. I'm still part of the Cannabis Africana team, working with Gernot, Simon, Neil, Meto, and the others, such as Maria Goret. If you could put the slides, Meto. So as Meto is putting the slides, today I've been asked to, though my focus was on Zimbabwe, where we have also conducted research. It's one of the countries that have legalized cannabis for medicinal and and industrial purposes, but all other uses like for adult usage, which others have called recreational purposes, it's still illegal, and as a result, also from our research, the country, despite having made some progress in terms of acknowledging and even legalizing cannabis for medicinal and industrial purposes, it is still bedeviled by similar challenges that we see in other countries, like the exclusion of small-scale producers who are still producing it illegally. But today, I'm looking at this new project that we are having, the post-prohibition cannabis policing, and I'm looking at it from a research point of view, and also the opportunities and maybe challenges that are emanating from trying to chart a new kind of dialogue or conversation after a long history where police activists and those who were using cannabis, they were kind of having a confrontational because of the context of prohibition. But now it requires that we now chart new ways, or we find some innovation to work together. And this project has presented some of those lessons which I want to share here. You can move to the next slide, Meto. So this is the map that Genot has already shared about, and if you look at it, it's not exhaustive. There are about maybe 9 to going to 11. Maybe other countries are at different levels in terms of the debates, but some have also taken those steps to legalize cannabis for medicinal and industrial purposes. With South Africa, the only one that has gone further also to legalize for personal production for personal use. But so as we are seeing, like what Genot has said, before this map would have been maybe like red, but those changes that we are seeing, they are not that significant in terms of just being the colors, but they are showing us also that things are changing. With these changes, we are charting into a future that all of us are unfamiliar with. It means that even the long cultures that we have, whether in terms of policing, they are bound also to be challenged because of these new changes that are taking place. So it's a future that the police have never been there, that is African police. They have never been there, for example, in terms of policing cannabis in contexts where it has been legalized. So we are saying that with this growing number of countries reforming their cannabis policies, we are likely to see some challenges and opportunities. There's also need to change in terms of how cannabis is being policed, but also even in terms of how we as researchers and civil society as well can engage and work with the police, because before our conversations were mediated with within the context of prohibition, but with the changes, what does it mean now? Meto, if you can go to the next slide. So looking at this project, it's not like doing something that others have not done, but I think it still comes with some significance as well, in that it is, I see it as breaking new ground in terms of how it is integrating or bringing research experts, civil society experts, and police experts into a police dialogue for an inclusive post-prohibition cannabis future. So it meant also that in terms of strategy, even as civil society, even as researchers as well, where we used maybe to vilify the police, but now we are trying to build the bridges where we could work together, because the, the the cannabis futures that are emerging require uh, us to do things in different ways. So, and this project, I think in a way, it has managed to just agreeing, sitting together with the police and civil society and the research, and agree that something needs to change. Why can we have a discussion and the research coming with some findings, and you have that conversation? I think this is something that even other countries within Africa, I think, are going to be learning from what this project maybe is doing in South Africa. It's not going to be solving everything or create a prototype that will work for everyone, but it shows that it's possible to begin to sit down and begin to think about how can we uh, formulate drug policy in an inclusive way, but in a way also that moves away from previous ways in which we policing culture was constructed. And again, here is taking us also what it is doing. It is grounded on evidence-based policing reform as the goal. Whether we'll get there, I think it's a product of the conversation that we are going to have. But the fact that these three from the beginning, these three layers that Geno talked about, the, uh, the, the research experts, the civil society experts, and the police experts sitting together and beginning to think about how can we draft standard operating procedures that are inclusive, but that are also in compliance and aligned with the new constitutional and the human rights environment. So I think it's something that uh, other African countries and other projects also could look at. But also, I see it as complementing the work that other organizations like the Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs, GI Talk, and West African Drug Policy Networks have begun to do. I had the privilege of attending two workshops organized by the Eastern and Southern Africa Commission together with the Global Initiative, one in Maputo, Mozambique, and also in Botswana. And they've tried to bring people together, including the police, but at that level, it's at a very more broader scale, like whether the whole of Southern Africa and Eastern Africa in one room. But I think this project now is carrying that kind of work at a national level, where I think it's going to be able to achieve more, because there's going to be that kind of dialogue. Meto, if we could move to the next slide. And what we are learning again from this project is that collaboration and dialogue, they are key to achieving the common and desired cannabis future that foregrounds human rights, respect, and dignity. And it is at that point, at that level, that I think is significant that you find someone like Meto sitting together with the police, despite the long history that the Meto and the police have. But the fact that it reminds me, for example, of the compromises that each side could make, like what, for example, happened when some of our countries were negotiating for independence, that they had to sit on the same table with the colonial countries that had done a lot of bad things for them. But I think that shows maturity, and I think that is needed as well. And this project, in a way, I think it is sending a lot of positive vibes, positive, effect in terms of what could be achieved when we prioritize collaboration and dialogue. And lastly, dialogue and collaboration between police and civil society. It can be fragile, I think, because of the long history that we have mentioned. Some have been arrested, but all of a sudden you need to sit together. So it means that we have to be strategic in terms of how we engage with the police, with the civil society, and with the other stakeholders as well, that the history, it is something that we should learn from, but it should not be something that will be like overshadowing the kind of conversation that we have. But we can learn better from there. Next slide, Meto. So these are the few reflections that I needed to make on this project that we are doing in South Africa, and just to highlight some of the key lessons and the key developments that are emerging, but also stating that we know that it's not straightforward, it's not going to be easy, but the fact that we are on this path where the three groups, and I think that in the future, I think like what the civil society element has managed also to bring in some community members as well through Fields of Green for All. So I think that is something that this project can provide those lessons for other countries that we could begin to address the mistrust between stakeholders, but also begin to chart a new cannabis future that is grounded around collaboration and dialogue. Thank you so much. I leave the time to Meto.
Thank you very much, Clemens. I think that it is a dream of ours at Fields of Green for All that South Africa can somehow, someday, be an example for the rest of Africa and inspire the rest of Africa. Because as it stands now, we're the first country in the whole world to get homegrown private use first. You know, it wasn't medicine first or hemp first. We've just had our Plant Improvement Act come into effect, and we have the highest threshold of THC for hemp at 2%, where the rest of the world is at 0.2%. So I think with these little wins along the way, we can maybe succeed in speaking to the police and changing their quota systems, changing their KPIs, SOPs, whatever you would like to call them, using our data that we've been gathering since 2014. Because what is happening in the rest of Africa, and what has been a central thing in our Cannabis Africana research on livelihoods and cannabis in Africa, is that countries like Ghana, Kenya, not really yet, but certainly Zimbabwe, and Lesotho, and soon to be Botswana, is that they are legalizing the use of cannabis for medicine for export, and the use of cannabis for industry for I don't know what, because they've still got to get their hemp industries in line, and you know there's no real history of the industrial uses of cannabis in Southern Africa. So my point always is, if you're going to legalize the cultivation and export of cannabis for sick white people in Europe, why are you not introducing it into primary health care in your countries? And why are you still arresting citizens in the streets? This is a really big bugbear for me. And it's happening literally 4 hours down the road from our house in Botswana, where they have the most expensive medicinal cultivation licenses in the world, even more expensive than California, so that they can send medicine to Europe and continue to arrest their citizens in the street. So this is no small challenge for us at Fields of Green to go and actually engage with the police. We've engaged with the communities. We continue to every single day of our lives. We've had our big community workshop. We have altogether, I've extended the deadline for the submissions. So I'm hoping to get at least 50 community submissions in by the end of March, so that I have all of those and I can collate them. And then together with Gernot, Neil, my experts, we can put together these community guidelines to go to the police and say, this is what the communities want. Because South Africa, although we are a very young democracy, we are a very strong democracy. And our constitution rules supreme over everything. So we are hoping that the fact that we have involved the communities to such a large extent will hold us in good stead. But I'm still terrified to go speak to the police, and I'm very, very pleased to have by my side Dr. Simon Howell, who is a criminologist. He has been our expert for many years. He was on our expert witness list for our trial of the plant in 2017. And even then, I remember sitting in the court in Pretoria in 2017, and Simon whispering to me and saying, "Don't worry, Myrtle, one day we're going to get the cops. One day we're going to change what they do. It'll come." Well, we're almost 10 years on, and Simon is still by our side advising us, and he's going to tell us about the second part of the project, which is actually the actual engagement with the police. So thank you very much, Simon, and we hand over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share this work. So this presentation introduces a project examining cannabis policing in South Africa, and in particular the gap that has emerged between legal reform and everyday policing practice. The central question guiding this work is quite simple. What happens after the law changes, but the institutional practice does not change at the same pace? I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Open Societies Foundation for funding this research, as well as Bristol University and the UKRI. So, in terms of context and a legal backdrop, in 2018, South Africa's Constitutional Court decriminalised the private use and cultivation of cannabis. This was a major legal shift, but like many court-driven reforms, it created a new legal environment faster than the operational systems could adopt, especially those from the police, which were embedded within their own context and institutional framework. So what this meant in practice is that the police officers on the ground are required to interpret a partially transformed legal framework, and they must distinguish between a complex set of parameters such as legal private use and illegal activity, often without clear operational guidance, a framework, or indeed many precedents. So the result of which is inconsistency and a vast array of different issues. So while the law changed relatively quickly, the practical realities of enforcement became significantly more complex. Despite the constitutional reform, cannabis-related arrests and seizures have continued across the country, and many of which have been significantly violent, but also significantly illegal. And this reflects, so in some ways, this reflects the not necessarily resistance to reform, but an uncertainty as to how the legal standards should be applied in practice. I think a lot of frontline officers continue to face a number of difficult questions, such as what constitutes personal use, what quantity suggests intent to sell, what distinguishes cultivation for personal consumption from commercial activity, all of which, again, create inconsistency. And without these consistent operational standards, enforcement outcomes can differ significantly between areas, between units, and even individual officers. And in a context where there is significant levels of distrust or mistrust between the public and the police, the inconsistent application of the law further creates that mistrust and further undermines the legitimacy of the policing organization in a context where that legitimacy was already very low levels. So cannabis enforcement is important not because of the substance itself, but also because it represents one of the most common everyday interactions between the police and citizens. These routine encounters play a major role in shaping how people understand fairness, rights, and legitimacy within the criminal justice system as a whole. So when enforcement appears inconsistent, people may begin to question whether the laws are being applied equally, applied to them, and the perception that develops, and when those perceptions develop, it can directly affect levels of trust and, of course, legitimacy. So this issue is not only about cannabis, it's actually about the way in which the police enforce the law across the board. So I think that the transition away from cannabis prohibition has exposed a structural gap, in that the law has changed, but the operational guidance and institutional routines have not fully kept pace. Addressing this, we believe, requires engagement on two fronts. Firstly, with the communities who experience cannabis enforcement directly, so the producers, the users, distributors, and the like, to understand how the law has been experienced in practice and what their concerns are. And then secondly, with the police institutions themselves, because sustainable reform must be owned internally if it is to influence everyday practice. And it's important to note here that this project aims not to necessarily just give them a prescript, or give law enforcement a prescript, or another set of instructions instructions or a lesson, so to speak, but rather to co-develop a set of standard operating procedures and eventually transform that into a national instruction which they have helped develop and which they own, so as that ownership continues long beyond when the project is finished. As mentioned, there are two focus areas here, or strategies. The first is community engagement, the second being institutional engagement, and the ultimate aim is to align three things, which is law, practice, and legitimacy, so as that the project ultimately demonstrates how research, participation, and institutional collaboration can help translate legal reform into practical change within policing systems, and of course to ensure that those policing systems are legitimate, that they are fair, and that they are within the prescripts of the law. And more importantly, as mentioned, it's important that the police own this project and that they co-develop these, because there is, having done research with police for a number of years now, there's a significant issue around simply providing and yet another training. The police have been to many trainings about many things, and they typically don't become embedded within policing practice because they are forced onto the police. They are not co-developed by the police. So it's that co-development and the creation of a toolkit rather than creation of answers themselves, which we believe will allow for ownership in the long run. I think that's all I've got time for. Thank you very much.
So another dream of mine has been to have the Honourable Neil Woods present at one of Fields of Green for All Side events. I think we met many years ago at one of the first African drug policy conferences in Cape Town. And I know certainly that Charles at home, who answers our arrest helpline, we've had a 24-hour arrest helpline since 2014, is the biggest fanboy of Neil Woods, because Charles has to deal with arrests and police and all the time, and what Neil says has always made great sense to us. So thank you, Neil.
The opinion that South Africa, to echo some of your thoughts in terms of leadership, Myrtle, I think that South Africa is, I formed the opinion then and I still have the opinion now, that South Africa is incredibly important in terms of international drug policy. And there's a very particular reason for that. So those of us that speak around the world here and there on drug policy, there is always a key issue relating to drug policy. It doesn't matter where you are. In some places we have incredible data like the UK or the USA to show that the policing of drug policy is racist, extraordinarily so. Even where racism is prevalent within the criminal justice system, drug laws are especially so, and dramatically much more so. And the reason for that is that our drug laws, our international drug policy regime, was always about racism. The international regime that we have is obviously written in the USA. It is the USA system because of the way that the rest of the world owed America money after the Second World War. It gave them extraordinary power in terms of controlling what the international regimes were. So specifically with cannabis in the UK, it used to be called cannabis in the USA actually, but they changed it to marijuana to make it sound more foreign so that they could more easily demonise Mexican people who, or Spanish-speaking people who were perceived to be, by virtue of the racist messaging, perceived to be the people who were consuming cannabis. And that's because in the Great Depression they were competing for white jobs, right? It's just as simple as that. Cocaine was only banned as a result of southern states maintaining the Jim Crow laws and looking for ways to further enslave black people. This is well documented, and there is strong evidence to support this premise. So that's why, for me, in 2017, South Africa became so extraordinarily important, because the same dynamics happen in South Africa, and yet black people are not the minority there. So you can even say that apartheid ended, but it didn't in a way, because drug prohibition maintains apartheid, at least to a degree, in South Africa. So to me, that becomes almost a sort of shining light reason in of itself for South Africa to show leadership, because this is an issue that affects everybody, but it's perversely self-harming in South Africa. Perversely, absolutely. So with the police enforcing it in the way that they are, within the same power dynamics of that was established in apartheid, it brings to mind the need for reforming police and criminal justice in general, of course, like the former speaker pointed out on the slide. But also, you also have to think within the South African context that South Africa suffers from extraordinary crime. And a lot of that crime is because of those inequalities, the failure to adequately repair those inequalities after apartheid. Now, and I'm speaking as an outsider here. I'm feeling slightly uncomfortable judging South Africa for an outsider there.
You're right. You're
But
right.
But apart from the institutional racism which exists, which could be a piece of fantastic leadership from South Africa, there's also the British part in this. So it's not all the United States' fault. Mostly, it's mostly your fault. Not pointing at you, but but it's also Britain also has a lot to answer for in this international racist element of the regime, because British colonies, including the ones in Africa, many of the laws that Britain imposed on its colonies were much more severe in terms of prohibition than imposed on our own citizens. So, for example, in most colonies, the law, which dates to the early 1950s or the end of the 1940s, laws included laws against consumption. So you could be prosecuted for consuming a drug, including cannabis, in many former colonies. In the UK, we never imposed that. We had laws against possession, but not consumption. And that's obviously because black and brown people can't be trusted in the same way. And it was just, it's just the strong arm of racist colonial thinking. And so when you talk about leadership within the African context, it adds another layer of importance, I think, that reform happens in South Africa. So I was excited in 2017. It was an exciting moment because this wonderful new constitution, this shining light of democracy, was really showing us the way. And the fascinating thing for me is that it was decided in a court on the constitutional basis, but it wasn't taking a poll of public opinion to influence the outcome of the court. So the politics that was argued around it was immaterial to the case, which is like inspiring, right? But it makes me think that all of the arguments that I heard, and I followed that case like many activists did, they apply to the other drugs as well. I would love to see South Africa go much further in terms of broader decriminalisation, and I actually think that would make the cannabis argument much easier. But beyond that, if you want to look at the problems of policing and dealing with the police, and I suppose that's why I'm sat here to comment about the police, so I will get there. The problem with police is that there's an extraordinary problem with crime in South Africa and growing problem of organised crime. And you've got all these extra external problems, like suddenly you've got the methamphetamine market coming using South Africa as a smuggling route from the Pakistan region. And all of these extra pressures on policing. And policing, like many countries, is really absolutely on its knees in South Africa. They are under incredible pressure. And the problem is when cops are under pressure, they use the tools that they know to try and deal with the problem that they see in front of them. And they do not see this problem through our lens. They don't. And the problem is that one of the tools that police use is to get information off people on the street to catch the dealer, because that's what they see as the result. And that mechanism is really difficult to unpick. So to the police, and all of the police I spoke to in 2017, and the ones I've spoken to in South Africa since, the decriminalisation of cannabis is a barrier to them doing their job, because they can't get the information to catch the dealers. So, now, this might sound like broad brushstroke wishful thinking, but the Overton window has to be pushed, and what South Africa really needs is full legal regulation as soon as possible. Because legal regulation is an easier sell to police. It's an easier sell. Decriminalisation, mostly, they just see as a difficulty to get around, or subvert, or ignore. But legal regulation is actually making things easier for the police. And in terms of public messaging and getting the public on board, if it's done right, arguing for legal regulation can actually be a way of empowering the police to embrace change. Because they've got a lot of problems. And you can free up police resources to deal with those other problems if you are taking a problem away from them. And that problem is removed by legal regulation. And that really could start a wave of legal regulation across Africa. I know I've spoken to people from Ghana who absolutely wish they could have legal regulation, including politicians. There's a lot of support for it there. And there's a lot of support from the farmers and the farmers' organisations. And what I love about what you always do in South Africa, Myrtle and your fellow activists, is that you do engage with people who use drugs, the relevant people. And I love to hear about the workshop, you know, working out how to deal with the police, but not having the police there yet. You've got to prepare for it, right? I love your approach for that. And of course that's needed, but at some point you're going to deal with the police. And maybe in that conversation with police, actually talking about how legal regulation will come eventually. It will come. But if you embrace it, you can shape it to actually help policing function better. You can actually help your mental health by reducing your workload. You know, you can actually start to feel like part of the community that you're stepping into, because that's a big barrier. It's a barrier everywhere because of prohibition, right? It's a barrier everywhere. But I think that's especially pertinent in South Africa, where connection with community and allowing communities to function with police to solve those collective problems is a massive piece of the puzzle that's missing in South Africa. So I commend you, really, because I have been privy to some of the work that you've done and the preparation, and you're really studying this problem. I commend you for the work that you've done already, and I very much hope it continues at the pace it has. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil, for those words of encouragement. But for those of you, I'll just fill you in what the situation is with cannabis in South Africa at the moment. So we got our constitutional judgment in 2018. The government, the legislature, were given 2 years in order to correct the defects in the law, as the court put it. We waited for 5 years for them to correct that, and we got the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act signed into law the day before the general election in May 2024. But now the thing is in South Africa is that if you have a new law, it needs to have regulations that go with it. So now since May 2024, we've been waiting for these regulations. Now at the beginning of February, the Department of Justice published the regulations for public comment. And on Thursday, just before we hopped on the plane to come here, we, as Fields of Green for All, put in our public comments. I know charities over there, SSDP, put in an amazing range of comments. I think that the Department of Justice probably got thousands and thousands of public comments. But we don't know what's going to happen. Just one day, suddenly we'll have legal cannabis for private purposes, because we don't know how long it's going to take for these regulations to be gazetted, to come into effect. And we also there's no public participation after these comments. So, and there's huge defects in these regulations, because in South Africa we've been growing cannabis for 700 years, and there's many, many areas, not only in Pondoland, many rural areas in South Africa where you can stand on a hill and there will be cannabis as far as the eye can see. But the regulations are saying we can only have 5 plants. Thank you, Germany, Canada, blah, 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 blah. So where does that leave us as an African country? 5 plants. I don't know why not 6 or 4. I'm not quite sure. So that's where, just to fill you in, that's where we're sitting at the moment. We don't know when these regulations, we don't know how many plants. They're saying that we can carry 750 grams of cannabis. But now if you grow 5 plants and you grow 5 majestic 4-meter high African sativas, you are going to produce a lot more than 750 grams. So you're going to have a series of very fast, very small fires to quickly consume whatever's over and above 750 grams. And our climate is such that you can in many areas of the country, you can only grow 1 crop per year. So you like 5 plants, you can only have 1 crop per year. Maybe you don't want to smoke African sativas. I don't really like smoking that stuff. It's got lots of amazing uses and it's amazing medicines and everything, but it's not the nicest weed you've ever come across. So what about my lank dank that I want to grow? I need a lot more than 5 plants. And then the 750 grams, they've got all these transport laws. You have to, if you have to inform the driver of the vehicle that you are carrying cannabis. You have to inform the other passengers in the vehicle that you are carrying cannabis. And as Neil said, you know, we have a terrible crime problem in South Africa, and particularly as women. And women have always had the job of transporting cannabis traditionally in South Africa. And I don't think I'm going to go to the Uber driver and tell him I've got a split in my pocket. I don't think so. So we have regulators who are writing the biggest load of nonsense regulations, and we've got the rest of our millions of cannabis users, traders, and consumers still being left out in the cold. So we're really pleased that everybody could join us today, hear our South African and our African story. Please follow us. We're on all over all social media. And just to end off, I've got a really heartfelt video that comes from our dear friend Bonky, who comes from a long line of cannabis cultivators in Mpondo land, which is one of our main traditional growing areas. And I thought I'd play Bonky's short little video to end off this session.
My name is Bonka Mfanekiso. I'm from Pondoland area, but I'm working for Pondoland Plug Project. So I just want to talk about the police, but how they behave of the police around Pondoland. Yes, there is some challenges, although they are not bad, you know. People around us, down to the villages, you know, has the same village, Mnibe. There is no police coming to the villages looking up and down the cannabis users. But when you go around town, there's still some police that are taking advantage. Since they are the police, you know, they're giving those ones that are around township the challenges. So we need just the police to take us as the same people, take us as our families, because this cannabis thing, this is the family things, not just the individual people, you know. So I just want to make an example, you know. There is one guy even in Cape Town. He was a policeman. He is the smoker. He is the use of cannabis. So they test him positively. After that, they fired his job. But after the judgment, so the judgment is saying, no, they must give him back his job because he didn't do anything wrong if it's just a use of cannabis. So there's many things like our police, they need to understand. We are the same family. Around Pondo people, this cannabis has been growing the families. So same as the policemen, they was grown in these cannabis things, you know. So really it's true that the lawmakers, when they making law, they must make sure that the police, they understood very well how they must treat the people, because we just want the people to treat us as the same, you know, as the same their cousin, as the same their uncle, as the same their mother. Not just to see someone on the street, he's the use of cannabis, and then you think he's a drug dealer. No one is a drug dealer, he's growing cannabis. If we are all families, we just want the police to treat us as their families. Also, we are their families, you know. They must just understand that part, you know, but we are the same family in South Africa. No one is different than another one.
You can see this beautiful young man, generations of growing cannabis, probably been arrested 20, 30 times in his young life. So we will, he's also very proud to have appeared at the UN today. So thank you so much.